Daniel Carter and Emily Rhodes were the kind of couple everyone in Blackridge thought they knew: quiet, private, and seemingly ordinary. Daniel, a hard-working mechanic, spent his days repairing cars and his nights tending to his secluded cabin near the forest. Emily, a dedicated schoolteacher, was admired for her kindness and patience, the type of person parents trusted with their children without hesitation. But one freezing January night, the lives of these two well-known residents would collide with a deadly secret. What began as a normal evening inside Daniel's cabin ended in a nightmare so shocking that by morning, both were lying dead in the snow, just feet apart, and the town was left asking a single, haunting question: what could drive two people to the same fatal choice at the exact same time? Winter had taken full control of the small mountain town of Blackridge. Snow had been falling for most of the week, slowly covering the streets, rooftops, and tall pine trees that surrounded the town. The roads were quiet, and the cold air carried a heavy silence that often comes with deep winter nights. Blackridge was the kind of place where life moves slowly. Most people knew each other, and serious crime was something the residents only heard about on the news from faraway cities. On one bitter January morning, the temperature had dropped far below freezing. The sky was pale gray, and a thin mist hung above the snow-covered ground. A local resident named Mark Ellison stepped out of his house early, pulling his thick coat tightly around him before beginning his usual walk with his dog along a narrow forest trail just outside town. The trail was normally peaceful, especially during winter when fewer people visited the area. Fresh snow had covered most of the ground overnight, leaving the path smooth and untouched. As Mark walked deeper along the trail, his dog suddenly became restless, pulling the leash toward the side of the path. At first, Mark assumed the dog had spotted a small animal hiding in the snow. But a few steps later, something unusual caught his eye. In the distance, two dark shapes were lying in the snow. They were partly covered by the thin layer of fresh snowfall, making them difficult to recognize at first. Mark slowed down, confused by what he was seeing. The shapes were too large to be branches or rocks. As he moved closer, a cold feeling settled in his chest. The shapes were bodies. Two people were lying only a few feet apart, motionless in the snow. Their clothes were stiff from the freezing air, and a light dusting of snow had already begun to cover them. The silence of the forest suddenly felt heavier than before, as if the entire area had frozen in that moment. Within hours, police cars and investigators arrived at the scene. As investigators began examining the scene, their attention quickly turned to the final hours of Daniel Carter and Emily Rhodes. In a town as small as Blackridge, it did not take long for officers to gather information about the couple. Many residents knew them, and their relationship had never attracted much attention or controversy. Daniel worked as a mechanic at a small auto repair shop on the edge of town. He was known as a quiet and hardworking man who preferred spending time alone or at his cabin near the forest. Emily, on the other hand, was a respected teacher at the local elementary school. Parents often described her as kind, patient, and dedicated to her students. The two had been together for nearly 2 years. Friends said their relationship seemed stable, though they were both private people who rarely shared details about their personal lives. They were often seen together at the local grocery store or walking through town on weekends, but they mostly kept to themselves. On the evening before their deaths, Emily had driven to Daniel's cabin shortly after sunset. A neighbor living a short distance away later remembered seeing her car parked outside the small wooden house. The weather had already begun turning dangerously cold, and most residents had stayed indoors that night to avoid the freezing wind. Inside the cabin, everything appeared normal during the early part of the evening. Phone records later showed both Daniel and Emily using their phones at different times, suggesting they were spending the evening quietly inside. The cabin lights were visible through the trees, and faint smoke rose from the chimney as the fireplace burned to keep the small home warm. But sometime close to midnight, the routine of the evening suddenly changed. Data from their phones revealed that both devices began moving away from the cabin. The signal showed them traveling slowly toward the nearby forest trail. The distance was not far, only a short walk through the... When investigators returned to the trail later that morning, The cold air had grown even sharper. A light wind moved through the tall pine trees, brushing loose snow from the branches and scattering it across the ground. The area around the bodies was carefully secured as officers began studying the scene in detail. The first thing they examined was the trail leading from Daniel's cabin. Fresh snow had preserved the tracks clearly, allowing investigators to follow them step by step. Two sets of footprints could be seen, leaving the direction of the cabin and moving slowly toward the forest path. The size and pattern of the tracks matched the shoes worn by Daniel and Emily. For several yards, the prints remained steady and close together, suggesting the two had walked side by side. There was nothing unusual about the way they moved. The steps were normal and evenly spaced, with no signs of running or struggling. But about halfway down the trail, something strange appeared. The footprints suddenly became uneven. Some of the steps looked deeper in the snow, as if the person making them had briefly lost balance. A few steps later, the track stopped entirely. Only a short distance ahead lay the bodies. Daniel was found lying on his side, partially turned toward the trail. Emily was a few feet away, face down in the snow. Both were dressed for the cold weather, wearing heavy coats and boots. A thin layer of fresh snow had already begun settling over them during the night. Investigators carefully studied the surrounding ground for signs that someone else had been there. If a third person had been involved, there should have been additional footprints or disturbed snow nearby. But there was nothing. The snow around the area looked almost untouched, smooth and quiet under the pale winter sky. No drag marks, no scattered tracks, and no evidence of any struggle could be found. At first, investigators believed the answer might be simpler than it appeared. The temperature that night had dropped to dangerously low levels, far colder than most people were used to in Blackridge. Exposure to extreme cold can cause confusion, dizziness, and sudden collapse. It seemed possible that Daniel and Emily had stepped outside for a short walk and underestimated how severe the weather had become. But that theory quickly began to fall apart. When a medical examiner completed the initial examination of the bodies, several details did not match the typical signs of death caused by hypothermia. People suffering from extreme cold usually show certain physical symptoms, including severe frostbite, prolonged exposure marks, or signs that they had struggled to stay warm. None of those indicators were clearly present. Instead, the examiner noticed something far more unusual. Both Daniel and Emily appear to have died almost at the exact same time. Their bodies showed no signs that one had lived significantly longer than the other. There were no defensive injuries, no wounds, and no clear evidence of violence. On the surface, their deaths remained unexplained. To find clearer answers, full toxicology tests were ordered. Investigators hoped the results might reveal whether alcohol, medication, or another substance had played a role in the tragedy. Several days later, the laboratory findings delivered a shocking discovery. Both victims had a rare chemical compound in their bloodstream. The substance was identified as a highly toxic industrial poison known for acting extremely fast once it enters the body. In even small amounts, it could cause rapid organ failure and sudden collapse within minutes. The concentration found in both Daniel and Emily was nearly identical. This meant something very unusual had happened. Whatever substance they had consumed had entered their bodies at almost the same time. But the biggest question remained unanswered. With the toxicology results raising more questions than answers, investigators turned their attention back to Daniel's cabin. If the poison had entered their bodies shortly before they died, there had to be some clue left inside the place where they had spent the evening. The small wooden cabin stood quietly at the edge of the forest, surrounded by snow-covered trees and a narrow driveway that led back toward the town. When detectives entered the cabin again, they carefully examined every room. At first glance, nothing appeared out of place. The living room looked tidy, and the fireplace showed signs that it had been burning earlier that night. A soft layer of ash rested inside the hearth, and a few pieces of wood remained nearby. The warmth from a fire had long since faded, leaving the cabin cold and silent. On the small table near the couch, investigators found 2 ceramic mugs. Both had been used recently. A thin stain of dried liquid clung to the inside of each cup. Forensic teams collected the mugs immediately, hoping laboratory tests might reveal what had been inside them. The kitchen area provided another clue. Inside the trash bin, detectives discovered pieces of a damaged plastic container. The label had been torn and partially burned, as if someone had tried to destroy it before throwing it away. Despite the damage, forensic specialists were able to recover enough of the printed text to identify the type of product it once held. It was a container used for storing a highly toxic industrial chemical, the same chemical that had been found in Daniel and Emily's blood. The discovery immediately raised new suspicions. Someone inside that cabin had clearly handled the poison shortly before the deaths occurred. But the evidence still did not explain why both of them had consumed it. If one person had planned to poison the other, something had clearly gone terribly wrong. As investigators continued examining the cabin, they focused on Daniel's personal belongings, especially his computer. The laptop sat on a small desk near the window, still plugged in but powered off. Forensic technicians carefully collected it and later began a full digital analysis to uncover anything that might explain what had happened that night. The results were unsettling. Daniel's internet history showed that he had been searching for information about toxic chemicals for several weeks. Many of the pages he visited described the effects of different poisons on the human body. Some articles explained how quickly certain substances could shut down vital organs, while others discussed how small doses could remain difficult to detect without detailed laboratory testing. At first, investigators wondered if Daniel had simply been curious about something related to his work. As a mechanic, he often handled various chemicals and industrial products. But the pattern of his searches suggested something much more deliberate. The research was specific, repeated, and focused almost entirely on lethal substances. Even more concerning were several deleted files that technicians managed to recover from the computer storage. These files included notes and bookmarked articles discussing extremely fast-acting toxins. Some documents even describe how certain chemicals could be mixed with drinks without leaving a strong taste or smell. The discovery began to shape a troubling theory. Investigators considered the possibility that Daniel had been planning to poison Emily. The chemical container found in the trash, along with his internet searches, seemed to point in that direction. It looked as though he may have prepared the poison earlier that evening and added it to something they both consumed. But one detail still refused to make sense. If Daniel had carefully planned to poison Emily, why would he also drink the same substance himself? Nothing in his research sug. As the investigation continued, detectives began looking deeper into Emily Rhodes' life. At first, there had been very little suspicion surrounding her. She was known in Blackridge as a calm and responsible teacher who had built a strong reputation in the community. Parents trusted her with their children, and colleagues described her as someone who rarely caused conflict. But in cases like this, investigators knew that even the most ordinary lives could hide unexpected secrets. Financial records soon revealed something that caught the attention of the detectives. Several weeks before the incident, Emily had taken out a large life insurance policy. The amount was significant, far more than most residents of the small town would normally carry. At the time the policy was created, the listed beneficiary had been Daniel Carter. At first, this seemed to support the idea that the couple had been planning a future together. But as investigators examined the documents more closely, they noticed a recent change. Just 2 days before the deaths, Emily had quietly updated the policy. Daniel's name had been removed. The new beneficiary listed on the insurance documents was her younger brother, who lived in another state. The change had been completed online and confirmed through digital records, leaving a clear timestamp that showed exactly when it happened. This discovery raised immediate questions. If Emily had planned to keep Daniel as the beneficiary, there would have been no reason to make such a sudden change. Detectives then requested a review of Emily's own online activity. What they found added another disturbing layer to the mystery. Her internet searches over the past month included several pages discussing poisonous substances and their effects. Many of the topics were strikingly similar to the research Daniel had been conducting. It slowly became clear that both Daniel and Emily had been hiding dangerous intentions. By the time investigators reached the final stage of the case, the pieces of the mystery had slowly begun to fit together. What first appeared to be an unexplained tragedy in the snow was now revealing a far darker and more complicated story. Detectives gathered every piece of evidence they had collected: phone records, forensic reports, computer data, and financial documents, to reconstruct the final hours of Daniel Carter and Emily Rhodes. The most logical explanation was both chilling and tragic. Earlier that evening inside the cabin, Daniel and Emily had likely prepared drinks while spending time together. At some point during the night, each of them secretly added poison to one of the mugs on the table. Both believed they were acting alone, carefully hiding their actions and assuming the other person would unknowingly consume the toxic substance. Neither of them realized the same plan was unfolding at the same time. When they eventually drank from the mugs, the poison entered their bodies almost simultaneously. The chemical found in their blood was known for acting extremely fast, attacking vital organs within minutes. At first, they may have only felt sudden discomfort or confusion, not yet understanding what was happening. As the toxins spread through their bodies, the symptoms likely became far more severe. Panic, dizziness, and intense pain would have followed quickly. Realizing something was terribly wrong, they left the warm cabin and stepped outside into the freezing night, possibly hoping the cold air might help them recover. But the poison worked faster than they could react. Only a short distance from the cabin, their strength failed. The uneven footprints in the snow showed the moment when their bodies began to collapse. Within seconds, both fell onto the frozen ground. By morning, the snow had quietly begun to cover them, leaving behind a silent and haunting scene that no one in Blackridge would ever forget.